8,000 men died taking one fort, then they lost the war. That is not chronicle exaggeration designed to glorify Christian resistance. That is the documented mathematical reality of what happened between May 24th and June 23rd, 1565, when Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's Ottoman army spent 31 days and 8,000 casualties capturing Fort Street. Elmo on Malta, a tiny star-shaped fortress defended by exactly 120 knights, who should have fallen in 3 days maximum by the time the crescent banner finally flew over Street. Elmo's shattered ramparts. The Ottoman Empire had bled so much that the siege was already lost despite months of fighting remaining. This is the story of how Grandmaster Jean de Valette weaponized a single fortress through deliberate sacrifice, how 31 days of hell consumed an empire's offensive power, and how 120 men dying slowly proved more lethal than any army. But before we talk about the 31 days that bankrupted an empire's ambitions, you need to understand the nightmare scenario unfolding on Malta that made sacrificing 120 men seem like strategic genius. May 18th, 1565, Mediterranean dawn revealed a sight that should have ended European Christianity forever. Across the azure waters surrounding Malta's rocky limestone shores, 193 Ottoman warships stretched to the horizon in every direction, their red banners snapping in the morning breeze like drops of blood. Aboard those vessels, 40,000 of Islam's finest warriors, prepared for what Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had personally promised would be his crowning achievement after 46 years of conquest. Standing on the limestone ramparts of Fort Street, Angelo, Grandmaster Jean de Valette, watched through his brass spyglass as the armada that had conquered Rhodes, terrorized Venice, and swept the eastern Mediterranean clean of Christian resistance, now focused its overwhelming might on his tiny island fortress. He commanded exactly 500 Knights of St. John and 8,000 Maltese militia against odds of nearly 5 to 1, numbers that military mathematics said meant Malta would fall within 1 week. Picture the massive Ottoman fleet as it approached Malta's southern coast. Each galley carried 200 men packed like sardines, their bronze cannons glinting menacingly in the sunlight. The flagship alone displaced 1,200 tons, mounting 64 guns capable of hurling 50-pound stone balls over half a mile with deadly accuracy. The dust cloud from 25,000 soldiers marching in perfect formation could be seen from 10 miles away on the island. When the fleet anchored in Marsaxlokk Bay, the combined weight of men and equipment was enough to make the shallow coastal waters visibly rise by several inches. But here is what the Ottoman chronicles written in Constantinople do not tell you about this siege. This was not just another conquest for Suleiman to add to his impressive list. This was intensely personal revenge that had festered for 43 years. In 1522, a young knight named Jean de Valette had helped humiliate the then young Sultan during the knight's desperate evacuation from Rhodes after a brutal siege. The 27-year-old Valette had personally commanded the rear guard that held Ottoman forces at bay long enough for the garrison to escape with their weapons, banners, and honor intact. Suleiman, barely 28 himself and hungry to prove his worthiness to succeed his father, had been forced to grant the defiant knights safe passage after 6 months of siege. The memory of those Christian banners sailing away defiantly from his conquered island had festered in the Sultan's mind through 4 decades of otherwise uninterrupted triumph. Now in 1565, Suleiman ruled an empire stretching from Budapest to Baghdad, from the Crimean Peninsula to Cairo, controlling more territory than Rome at its height. His armies had shattered Hungarian knighthood at Mohacs, besieged the gates of Vienna itself, and turned the Mediterranean into what Europeans bitterly called an Ottoman lake. At 71 years old, he commanded resources that dwarfed any European power individually. The siege train approaching Malta included 64 massive bronze cannons, each requiring 12 oxen just to move, capable of firing 6,000 rounds per day collectively. Behind Admiral Piyale Pasha's naval expertise stood General Mustafa Pasha, a veteran of dozens of successful sieges, commanding 15,000 elite janissaries who had literally never known defeat in their entire military careers. Against this oceanic force that seemed unstoppable, Valette had assembled what appeared to be a hopeless defense that defied rational military thinking. Malta's strategic position made it the cork in the Mediterranean bottle, controlling all naval movement. Control this island, and Ottoman fleets could strike Sicily, Naples, even Rome itself, without opposition. The knights understood the desperate mathematics perfectly. Their treasury held enough silver to hire perhaps 2,000 mercenaries for 3 months of fighting. The island's limestone soil barely supported 20,000 inhabitants, producing insufficient grain to feed defenders through a long siege. Water came entirely from carefully maintained rainwater collection systems that could be poisoned or contaminated by enemy action. Yet as Ottoman landing boats hit Malta's southern beaches on May 19th, something impossible began to unfold that would change naval warfare. Valette had spent 43 years since Rhodes, transforming this barren rock into Europe's deadliest fortress trap. The Ottomans expected another Rhodes, a swift siege, followed by negotiated surrender once the walls fell. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy who had studied every detail of Ottoman tactics for decades, anticipated their every move through intelligence, and prepared surprises that would cost Suleiman's empire far more than one small Mediterranean island was worth. The question facing Malta was not whether the fortresses would eventually fall to overwhelming force. The question was, how many of Islam's finest warriors would die discovering that some prizes carried prices too terrible for empires to pay? The Ottoman landing force struck Malta's southern coast on May 20th like a bronze-tipped spear thrust into limestone bedrock. By dawn, Mustafa Pasha had established his beachhead at Marsaxlokk Bay with surgical precision that demonstrated decades of amphibious warfare experience. 8,000 janissaries deployed in perfect geometric formation, while military engineers began the backbreaking work of dragging massive siege guns inland. The knights, watching nervously from Birgu's walls, counted 64 bronze cannons, each weighing 3 tons and requiring teams of 40 sweating men to position. What should have been a chaotic amphibious assault had become a textbook demonstration of Ottoman military efficiency refined through 2 centuries of conquest. Valette stood on the ramparts of Fort Street. Angelo, his weathered 70-year-old hands gripping the limestone battlements as he studied enemy deployment through his brass spyglass with the intensity of a chess master. The Grand Master had personally witnessed more sieges than any living commander in Christian Europe. But the methodical precision of Mustafa's approach sent ice through his veins despite decades of experience. The Ottoman general was systematically establishing artillery positions that would allow him to bombard all 3 Christian strongholds simultaneously in coordinated fire: Birgu, Singlia, and the small, star-shaped fortress of Street. Elmo formed a defensive triangle around Grand Harbour, Malta's natural deep-water anchorage where the knight's few remaining galleys lay moored like trapped birds. Then came the decision that would haunt military historians and strategic theorists for centuries afterward. Instead of concentrating his overwhelming firepower on Birgu, the knight's main stronghold and centre of resistance, Mustafa chose to begin the siege with Street. Elmo, the tiny star-shaped fort, commanded the entrance to Grand Harbour with its 8 bronze cannons and garrison of exactly 120 men under Captain Luis de Miranda. Ottoman military doctrine refined through generations demanded securing one's flanks before advancing into enemy territory. Since Street. Elmo's position directly threatened any ships attempting to enter Grand Harbour for resupply. What appeared to be sound tactical thinking was actually the first link in a chain that would strangle the Ottoman war machine. Here is what Mustafa's staff officers could not have possibly known about Valette's defensive genius born from decades of study. Street Elmo was not meant to be defended indefinitely until relief arrived. The fort's angular bastions and carefully calculated interlocking fields of fire had been designed deliberately as a killing ground, a place where Ottoman assault troops would die in such catastrophic numbers that the siege would become economically and politically unsustainable. Every stone had been positioned by military engineers to channel attacking forces into zones of crossfire. The approach routes forced enemies to advance uphill across 200 yards of completely open ground, swept by artillery fire from 3 different directions simultaneously. By May 24th, the Ottoman siege train had completed its deadly deployment. 64 cannons opened fire simultaneously at dawn, their bronze voices echoing across the Mediterranean like thunder trapped in a stone bowl. The mathematical precision of the bombardment was absolutely staggering to witnesses. Each gun could fire 12 rounds per hour under optimal conditions, meaning 768 stone balls weighing 50 pounds each crashed into Street Elmo's walls every single 60 minutes. The limestone fortifications, 15 feet thick at their base, began to crack and crumble visibly under impacts that struck with force equivalent to modern artillery. Captain Miranda's 120 defenders crouched in the smoking ruins as stone fragments filled the air like deadly snow driven by wind. The sensory assault was overwhelming beyond anything men had experienced. The crash of cannonballs striking solid stone, the screams of wounded men whose bodies were crushed by falling masonry, the acrid gunpowder smoke that turned bright noon into apocalyptic twilight. Yet the fort's angular bastion design was working exactly as Villette had planned during years of preparation. Cannonballs that would have punched clean through traditional round towers struck the angled bastions at oblique angles and deflected relatively harmlessly into the harbour. What should have been a 3-day bombardment was stretching into its second week, with the fort still defiantly flying its banner. But then everything changed on the morning when the guns fell silent. Ottoman trumpets sounded the advance signal that every defender had been dreading. 8,000 Janissaries emerged from their forward trenches in perfect, disciplined formation, their distinctive white felt caps bobbing like a deadly sea as they surged towards street. Elmo's shattered walls in coordinated waves. These were not ordinary conscripted soldiers or feudal levies. Each Janissary had trained for 15 years in weaponscraft, siege warfare techniques, and absolute unquestioning obedience to orders. They had stormed the legendary walls of Belgrade, Constantinople, and Rhodes. A handful of knights behind crumbling stone barriers should have lasted mere minutes against such professional warriors. The first assault wave hit street, Elmo's main breach like a human tsunami carrying everything before it. What happened next defied every principle of siege warfare that Mustafa had learned through 30 years of successful conquests. Instead of overwhelming the tiny garrison through sheer weight of numbers, as doctrine predicted, the Janissaries found themselves funneled into a nightmare of crossbow boats and Greek fire that turned their disciplined advance into a charnel house. By sunset, when the assault was called off, 400 elite Ottoman troops lay dead in the rubble for the loss of exactly 12 knights. The mathematics of attrition had suddenly and impossibly reversed from what every calculation predicted. The siege of Street, Elmo entered its third week with the mathematical precision of a death clock ticking toward inevitable conclusion. Each dawn brought the exact same ritual that never varied. Ottoman cannons thundered for precisely 4 hours, reducing more limestone fortifications to powder and rubble. Each afternoon delivered fresh waves of Janissaries crashing against the diminishing walls like ocean swells against a crumbling cliff. By June 10th, Captain Miranda's original 120 defenders had been reduced to 80 men, still capable of effective fighting. Yet the tiny fort still defiantly flew its white banner emblazoned with the 8-pointed cross of the Knights of St. John. Mustafa Pasha stood in his silk command tent, studying casualty reports that made absolutely no mathematical sense according to any doctrine. His staff officers had calculated with confidence that Street Elmo should have fallen in 5 days maximum, given the overwhelming force applied. The reality staring back from blood-stained parchment told a completely different story that defied explanation. 3,000 Ottoman dead against 40 night casualties. At this horrific exchange rate, taking the main fortresses of Birgu and Singlea would cost him his entire army and accomplish nothing. The general who had conquered Belgrade and Damascus found himself trapped in an arithmetic nightmare entirely of his own making. Here is where legend meets brutal documented reality in the chronicles. Each night, as Ottoman sentries watched Street Elmo's walls carefully, dark shapes moved across Grand Harbour like water spirits. Knights were swimming the 400-yard channel between Birgu and Street Elmo, carrying fresh ammunition and volunteer reinforcements to the doomed garrison, knowing they swam towards certain death. The volunteers knew with absolute certainty they were swimming toward inevitable death in days. Yet they came anyway because duty demanded it. Fra Roberto de Eboli made the crossing 7 times, each dangerous journey laden with precious Greek fire containers and crossbow bolts. On his 8th attempt, Turkish arquebusiers finally found their mark with a lucky shot. His body washed ashore at dawn the next morning, still clutching a waterproof leather pouch containing 50 gold coins for the defenders' families. But Valet's tactical genius extended far beyond individual heroism that inspired men. Every single night, the Grand Master dispatched exactly enough reinforcements to keep Street Elmo fighting one more day, but deliberately never enough to significantly strengthen it strategically. The fort had become a deliberate, calculated sacrifice, a cold mathematical calculation as emotionless as winter steel. Each Ottoman soldier who died assaulting those crumbling walls was one fewer veteran available for the real siege of Birgu that would decide Malta's fate. Each expensive cannonball expended on limestone rubble was one less round available for the critical battle yet to come. Street Elmo was not being defended in any traditional sense. It was being weaponized as a tool to bleed the enemy. The psychological warfare escalated beyond conventional siege tactics into something darker. On June 15th, after losing 200 Janissaries in a single morning assault that gained nothing, Ottoman commanders ordered something that violated every code of military honor. The severed heads of captured knights were loaded into cannons as projectiles and fired into Birgu's central square where civilians could see them. The message was unmistakable to everyone. This is the fate awaiting every defender. Surrender now while terms are possible, or face systematic butchery. Valet's response arrived the following dawn with equal brutality. Turkish heads catapulted from Street Elmo's walls landed in Mustafa's command camp with surgical accuracy. The 70-year-old Grandmaster had just declared that 2 could play the game of terror. June 16th dawned with an ominous silence that made even seasoned warriors check their weapons nervously. No cannon fire, no trumpet calls. Ottoman assault troops massed in their forward trenches like coiled springs ready to explode. 8,000 men preparing mentally for what everyone knew would be Street Elmo's final hours. Captain Miranda walked the fort's shattered ramparts at dawn, counting his effective defenders remaining. 9 knights remained physically capable of fighting. 9 men against the cream of the Ottoman Empire's professional military. The mathematics had reached their logical, inevitable conclusion. The final assault began at noon with a precision that would have impressed Julius Caesar himself. Wave after wave of Janissaries poured through the multiple breaches in walls that no longer existed, their curved scimitars flashing in the bright Mediterranean sun. The 9 remaining knights fought with the absolute fury of men who knew death was inevitable within hours but refused to make it cheap for their enemies. Miranda himself died sword in hand at his cannon, cut down by Turkish blades while loading grape shot into the muzzle with his bare, bleeding hands. Fra Juan Guaras held the main breach completely alone for 10 endless minutes, his blade carving a circle of death around the knight's banner until Turkish arrows finally found their mark in his throat. When the white flag with its distinctive 8-pointed cross finally fell at last, Ottoman casualties for Street Elmo alone numbered 8,000 dead and seriously wounded. Mustafa Pasha surveyed his Pyrrhic victory from the smoking ramparts, calculating costs that made his hands physically tremble. If a minor fortress defended by 120 men could exact such a terrible price, what would the main defences of Malta demand from his army? Behind him, across Grand Harbour, clearly visible, the real fortresses of Birgu and Senglia remained completely untouched, their walls bristling with artillery and their garrisons fresh for battle. The Ottomans had won Street Elmo through overwhelming force, but they had lost something far more valuable strategically. They had lost the summer campaign season. With Street Elmo finally silenced after 31 days, Mustafa Pasha turned his surviving artillery toward the real prize that mattered. The twin fortresses of Birgu and Senglia commanded Grand Harbour, like stone guardians that had never fallen, their massive limestone bastions rising 80 feet above the water. Between them stretched a floating bridge protected by a massive iron chain, allowing defenders to reinforce each position rapidly as needed. What the Ottomans now faced was no longer a single isolated fort, but an interconnected fortress complex designed by the finest military engineers in Europe specifically to resist siege. Valette had spent the entire month of Street Elmo's agony preparing his main defences for the storm he knew was coming. The bombardment that began on July 15th dwarfed anything Europe had ever witnessed in siege warfare. 100 Ottoman cannons firing simultaneously created sound waves so powerful they shattered windows in Sicily, 60 miles away, across open water. The mathematical brutality was absolutely staggering to observers. Every minute, 200 stone balls weighing 50 pounds each crashed into the fortress walls with impacts measuring 15 tons per square foot of pressure. The limestone dust rose in clouds so thick that bright noon became twilight, and men fought with scarves wrapped around their faces just to breathe. But here is what separated Malta from every other siege in Ottoman history that had always ended in victory. The knights were not just enduring the bombardment passively, they were fighting back with tactical innovations that would revolutionize fortress warfare for centuries. Mobile cannon platforms allowed defenders to rapidly move their artillery between different bastions as sections came under concentrated enemy fire. Underground tunnels connected every major defensive position, enabling rapid redeployment of reserve forces. Most importantly, for long-term defense, Valette had distributed command authority among multiple knights, ensuring that losing any single position would not collapse the entire defensive structure. August first arrived with an ominous silence that made even seasoned warriors check their weapons twice nervously. At dawn, Ottoman signal flags fluttered from Mustafa's command post, coordinating the largest assault of the entire siege. 15,000 men would attack simultaneously from 3 different directions. 5,000 Janissaries would storm Birgu's land walls, while another 5,000 struck Senglia from the south. Meanwhile, 5,000 Turkish Marines would assault the floating bridge from galleys, attempting to sever the critical connection between the fortresses. The mathematics were absolutely overwhelming. Even if the knights fought with superhuman skill, they faced odds of 25 to 1. The coordinated attack began at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning with a precision that would have impressed Alexander the Great. Ottoman trumpets echoed across the harbour as assault columns advanced in perfect formation, their scimitars catching the morning sun like thousands of deadly mirrors. The sound was overwhelming to senses. 20,000 feet marching in perfect unison. The clash of steel on stone as scaling ladders struck the fortress walls, the roar of defenders shouting orders in 6 different languages simultaneously. This was not just a battle in any conventional sense. It was controlled chaos involving more men than most European cities contained. Then everything accelerated beyond human comprehension into pure violence. Janissaries reached Birgu's walls and began scaling ladders while their comrades poured Greek fire into breaches created by weeks of sustained bombardment. Turkish marines swarmed aboard the bridge galleys, their boarding axes sparking against night steel in hand-to-hand combat that left absolutely no room for retreat by either side. At the exact same moment, assault troops struck Senglia's southern bastion, their war cries echoing off limestone walls as defenders poured boiling oil from the ramparts directly above. What happened next defied all military logic developed over centuries. Jean de Valette, 70 years old and supposedly too physically frail for combat, appeared personally at Burgos's most critically threatened breach. The Grand Master fought with a two-handed sword, his white hair streaming as he personally cut down janissaries who had never imagined facing their enemy's supreme commander in single combat. His sudden appearance electrified the entire defense instantaneously. Knights who had been falling back suddenly surged forward with renewed energy. Maltese militia who had been wavering picked up dropped weapons and rejoined the fight. The tide of battle turned in 17 minutes of sustained combat. Ottoman assault troops, expecting to face demoralized defenders, instead encountered resistance that grew progressively stronger under pressure. The floating bridge held despite losing half its defenders to casualties. Senglia's walls remained intact despite concentrated bombardment. Most impossibly, Birgu's main breach became a killing ground where Turkish elite troops died faster than reinforcements could replace them. By noon, when the assault finally ended, 3,000 Ottoman dead carpeted the approaches to both fortresses, while night casualties numbered fewer than 200. But the real shock came when Mustafa tallied his total losses that evening. The 6-hour assault had cost him 15% of his entire army in a single morning. At this catastrophic exchange rate, actually taking Malta would require losses that would cripple Ottoman military power for an entire generation. Standing in his tent, surrounded by casualty reports, the general who had conquered half of Europe made a calculation that would echo through military history. He could take Malta through sheer persistence, but the price would destroy the very empire the victory was meant to serve. The question was no longer whether the fortresses would eventually fall to overwhelming force. The question was whether Suleiman's army would survive the process of taking them. As the September 8th sun reached its zenith over Malta, the impossible had become reality. The relief fleet of Don Garcia de Toledo stretched across the northern horizon like a constellation of salvation. 28 galleys carrying 8,000 fresh Spanish and Italian troops toward Malta's smoking shores. From the ramparts of Birgu, Jean de Valette watched through his brass spyglass as the Ottoman army that had terrorized Europe for 4 months began its final frantic preparations for withdrawal. Mustafa Pasha faced the nightmare scenario that had haunted his dreams since Street Elmufeld. His siege army, reduced to 25,000 exhausted men after months of grinding attrition, now found itself caught between the anvil of Malta's fortresses and the hammer of Spanish steel approaching from the sea. The timing was impossibly perfect, as if choreographed by divine providence rather than human planning. Don Garcia's landing boats hit the beaches at Maliha Bay precisely as Valette ordered his final desperate gamble. The fortress gates of Birgu and Senglia swung open simultaneously, disgorging 600 knights and 3,000 Maltese militia who had survived the longest siege in Mediterranean history. These were not fresh troops charging into battle. They were scarred veterans who had endured 15 weeks of daily bombardment, men whose hollow eyes held the look of those who had seen hell itself and somehow survived to tell about it. What followed defied every principle of military science that Mustafa had learned in 3 decades of conquest. His army, positioned to assault the fortresses from landward approaches, suddenly faced coordinated attack from 2 directions simultaneously. The Spanish cavalry, 500 mounted knights, led by Don Garcia himself, smashed into the Ottoman siege lines like a steel avalanche while the fortress defenders struck from behind. The psychological impact was absolutely devastating to Ottoman morale. Janissaries who had spent months staring at Malta's walls suddenly found themselves fighting desperately for their lives against an enemy they had thought broken. The collapse was total and catastrophic beyond belief. In 60 minutes of sustained combat, the Ottoman siege army that had conquered Belgrade, Damascus, and Rhodes disintegrated into a fleeing mob. The mathematics of rout were merciless in their efficiency. 3,000 Turkish dead carpeted the ground between the landing beaches and the fortress walls, while Christian casualties numbered fewer than 200. Entire companies of Janissaries, the absolute elite of Islamic military power, died where they stood, rather than face the shame of retreat. Their distinctive white felt caps dotted the battlefield like fallen snow, each marking a warrior who had trained 15 years for this moment of disaster. Here is what the Ottoman chronicles, written in Constantinople, tried to hide about those final chaotic hours. The retreat became a headlong flight that abandoned military equipment worth more than the annual revenue of most European kingdoms. 64 bronze cannons, each representing months of skilled craftsmanship, lay abandoned in their firing emplacements. Tens of thousands of stone cannonballs, cut and precisely shaped by master masons, became rubble scattered across Malta's limestone plains. The siege that was supposed to demonstrate Ottoman supremacy had become the empire's most expensive military disaster. Mustafa Pasha, the general who had never lost a siege in his entire career, stood on the deck of his flagship as Malta's cliffs receded into the Mediterranean haze. The butcher's bill made grim reading. Of the 40,000 men who had sailed confidently from Constantinople in May, barely 15,000 remained effective for future campaigns. The Janissary Corps, backbone of Ottoman military power, had lost 8,000 men, including some of their most experienced officers. More devastating than the human cost was the strategic catastrophe it represented. The Ottoman Empire had expended its entire annual military budget, capturing a barren rock 17 miles long, then lost it again in a single afternoon. But the knights had paid their own terrible price for salvation. Of Valet's original 500 knights, only 250 remained alive and unwounded. The Maltese militia had suffered proportionally higher losses, with entire villages losing their adult male population during the siege. The limestone fortresses that had seemed so mighty in May now resembled lunar landscapes, their walls pocked with thousands of cannon impacts, their bastions rebuilt multiple times with rubble and desperate prayers. As evening fell on September 8th, the survivors gathered in the smoke-blackened chapel of Street Lawrence to offer prayers of thanksgiving. Valet knelt before the altar where he had prayed every morning of the siege, his white hair singed by Greek fire, his hand still bearing the calluses from personally manning the cannons during the August assaults. The Grand Master, who had defied mathematics and military logic for 107 days, finally allowed himself a moment of human exhaustion. Around him, his surviving knights removed their dented helmets and battle-stained surcoats, revealing faces aged years beyond the months they had endured. The victory bells that rang across Christian Europe, that autumn carried news that would permanently reshape the balance of Mediterranean power. Malta had held against impossible odds, but more importantly, the myth of Ottoman invincibility lay shattered among the limestone rubble of Street Elmo's walls. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent never recovered from Malta's humiliation that ended his reign. The Sultan, who had terrorized Europe for 46 years, died 3 years later while besieging the Hungarian fortress of Szigetvar, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated strain of empire and defeat. His successors would launch increasingly desperate campaigns to restore Ottoman prestige, but the empire's golden age of conquest had ended permanently in Malta's limestone dust. The tide of Islamic expansion that had swept across the Mediterranean for 3 centuries broke forever against Valet's walls. If you want to understand how 500 knights held Malta through strategic genius rather than simple courage, subscribe immediately, because next week we are revealing the engineering innovations Valet used to create interlocking fields of fire, the exact training methods that turned swimming reinforcements into a systematic resupply operation, the psychological warfare tactics that both sides employed with heads fired from cannons, and why Street Elmo's 31-day defense bankrupted an empire that seemed unstoppable. So, smash that subscribe button now, because understanding how Valet weaponized a fortress through deliberate sacrifice changes everything you think you know about siege warfare. And the principles of strategic patience, proven in Malta's limestone dust, still influence modern military doctrine taught today at war colleges, where making every soldier count matters more than counting soldiers.